Story 1. One of my good friends died just shy of her 25th birthday from complications due to an autoimmune disorder. The last conversation we had was about her hopelessness in ever paying off her already massively accrued medical debts. She was the sweetest, most whimsical, and most generously loving person I have ever known, and I did not get to hear her laugh the last time we talked. I have been a staunch supporter of universal healthcare since. I would gladly pay higher taxes if it means no one has to go through the anguish she experienced in the very last days of her too young life. Story 2. I was always more on one side than the other, but went further on that side when I saw homelessness. There was a family that my family and I helped. They were working, sober, and did not live above their means. Their child was sick with brain cancer, and they lost everything trying to get him treatment. There was no help at all for them. I called everyone. My family called everyone. A priest said he could pray for them, but that was all. We were told they could get canned food at the food bank. They did not have a kitchen or anything. They were living in a car and trying to work. Then, as if seeing that was not enough, it happened to me too. It is even worse for single people. I was literally told there were no beds in multiple homeless shelters. Again, working, no criminal record, never did drugs, nothing, just could not afford a place to live. I have so many other stories. I have seen the hell that no workers' rights, no tenants' rights, sickness, and poor social programs can cause. Never would I advocate for taking away the already strained social programs people need to live. Story 3. I grew up in a very conservative Christian town in the southern United States. Since that was all I had ever known, that is how I became too, until I went to an actual city for college. I needed community service hours to keep my scholarships, so I started volunteering at a homeless shelter near the campus. Speaking to the people there opened my eyes in a way I had never experienced before. Teenagers, single mothers, elderly people, individuals I had been told were lazy, but in reality were just regular people dealt bad hands. I started questioning my whole set of principles after that. After much soul-searching and hard work, I believe I am in a better place ideologically. Much farther left than my family, but also much more confident in my beliefs, since I made them myself instead of simply being told what to think. Story 4. I watched my family struggle to get medical coverage for my grandparents. It makes me think that a single-payer system cannot be worse than what we have now. Story 5. I never had a problem with LGBTQ+ people to begin with. A friend of mine came out as gay to me when I was about 11, and my response was something along the lines of, "That's cool." But when my uncle died suddenly from a heart attack and I met the man who was introduced to the family as his good friend, I realized that it is important for me to be outspokenly supportive. It was heartbreaking to see this man not only mourn the death of his partner but also unable to mourn openly because parts of the family did not want people like him alive in the first place. Story 6. Made friends with a gay man as a young Christian when I was about 16. I stopped hating gay people after that. Story 7. I watched Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger deceive the entire country as they secretly killed hundreds of thousands of innocent Cambodian peasants, while poor kids from the United States received their draft board notices. My best friend, who was very poor, was killed by friendly fire on his first day in Vietnam. My neighbor came home dying from exposure to Agent Orange. I was 6 months from draft age when they ended the conflict. Story 8. Talking to people who were not in the echo chamber I was raised in, it turns out people are people and not politically convenient stereotypes. Story 9. It's mainly about being open to meeting people, getting to know them, challenging yourself to learn about things you have never experienced before, or discovering things you do not understand, and being open-minded. You will be surprised how many people are willing to become your teacher about many parts of life, different views, and perspectives. You get to grow as a person and hopefully become kinder, more compassionate, and more aware in the process. Story 10. Domestic violence against men is also a serious issue in society. When I was working in fast food, I had a coworker who often dramatized situations. One day, she came in with her hands bloodied and bandaged. She spent the entire day bragging about how she had beaten her boyfriend for cheating on her. Even more disturbing was how she seemed comfortable saying he did not even fight back. I asked her if he had ever hit her in the past, And she said no. Not a single person challenged her narrative. She clearly injured him badly, and while cheating is wrong, it does not justify the physical violence she inflicted. I reported her to the police, but I doubt they seriously followed up on it. Story 11. Gay nephew. He was very effeminate throughout his childhood. He came out involuntarily in high school, and we all thought, that makes sense. At the time, conservatives argued that being gay is a choice. I thought, there is no way this shy, timid, super obedient, deeply religious Mormon/Latter-day Saints mother's boy chose to be gay. Edit to add. They sent him to conversion therapy, which he found deeply traumatizing. Poor kid. Story 12. Abortion views changed completely when I started knowing women who were pregnant and learned about what can happen to them. Story 13. I was a neoconservative in college. After graduating, I lived in the real world for a while and went through some really tough times. I realized how difficult life can become without safety nets. I also recognized that I had been unempathetic. Now, I firmly hold left-leaning and liberal political views. Story 14. My views on immigration changed significantly after volunteering with refugees. I met some truly amazing people who had gone through immense hardship. Story 15. Dead of winter, sitting in North Station in Boston waiting for the train. Every time the doors opened, we were hit with bitter cold. Terrible even when the doors were only open for a few moments. The place is practically empty. 2 homeless men are on a bench, one of many empty benches. If you know the place, you know what I mean. 2 police officers walk over and start telling them they have to leave. One of them was asleep. His friend wakes him up and says, "We can't stay here." Then they walked out the door into the cold. Story 16. People used to ask me why my little sister had a different skin color. I had to keep repeating, "What sister? All my sisters are just my sisters." When I was about 10 years old. Story 17. It's more about what I no longer saw. I quit watching Fox News. It took less than a year for my views to do a complete turnaround. Story 18. It is very telling that almost every one of these statements says, I went from conservative to liberal because I or someone close to me experienced something. Story 19. I used to support the police until my business was robbed and no one responded for 7 hours. I realized reform is needed, not removal. Story 20. In middle school, my parents did not really expose me to politics. I would go over to my girlfriend's house, and her dad was a staunch conservative Republican. He would talk to me about his religion, his beliefs, and things he felt I should know. I stayed overnight at my girlfriend's house one time, and he got drunk and beat his wife. The next day, he got on his knees, cried, and prayed to God to make him better. Then he turned on the television to his favorite political programming and acted like nothing had happened. I went home, talked to my mom, learned the true definition of hypocrisy, and decided when I was young which way I would lean. Story 21. At the University of Missouri protests in 2016, there was a YIK post, a social media platform similar to Twitter, stating that someone was going to shoot all the black people. The next day, I was walking to class and saw a black girl holding her keys between her fingers and walking defensively. It struck me that my fear of being collateral damage was nothing compared to her fear of being a target. This experience opened my eyes and marked the beginning of my political shift from Republican to liberal. Story 22. I was a young newly married husband, and the insurance company said my wife had a pre-existing condition, so her procedure would not be covered. I have not voted for the Republican Party since then. Story 23. I used to have some negative biases towards Muslims until I had to interact with them and get to know them. I grew up in a very rural community where I would have had to drive 3 hours to see 2 Muslims in the same room. I did some tours overseas, and it completely changed my opinions. Story 24. I applied for a government job. I realized that if these are the people in charge of the country, then we are in serious trouble. Story 25. In 2001, Georgia changed its state flag design from the one I grew up with. I was 19 years old, and everyone I knew was upset about it. I heard so much about how it was erasing history and how it was history, not hate. I finally decided to look up the history of The state flag. The one I grew up with was not the original one and was only changed in the mid-1950s, specifically to incorporate the stars and bars the Confederate flag racists fly, after the passage of Brown versus Board of Education as a defiant gesture to black people. I grew up passively listening to my parents and other adults who I thought were authorities on all sorts of things. This was my first realization that adults are just older kids who may not know anything, and I was on my own to form my own opinions, so I had a lot of work to do. I have since corrected many of my misconceptions, but that was my first political step toward emancipation. Story 26. Former die-hard Republican here. I started to wonder why people are not calling out Republican leadership's hypocrisy. Why are people supporting a man like Donald Trump, someone who lacks ethics, morals, and any semblance of decorum or integrity? That made me realize they are all liars, and it is about them feeling superior to others. Then, I realized that feeding children is okay. Treating people with respect and dignity is okay. Perhaps taxing people who have overwhelming wealth is acceptable to allow societal advancements for the good of the public. Now, apparently, I am a bleeding heart liberal with a victim complex who might be gay, according to my sister. I have no idea where her ideas came from. Story 27. I was pro-George W. Bush and the Iraq War and said so in a college class taught by an Iranian woman. I said at the beginning of the whole situation before we knew the truth. Well, if we find weapons of mass destruction, then it's probably a just war, right? I saw her face drop as trauma entered her mind, and she said, I was a nurse during the Iran-Iraq conflict. I saw horrible things. People killed and dying, poisoned by chemical weapons. Nearly in tears, she continued, no war is ever justified. It's never right. Seeing her fear and sadness as she said that woke something up in me, and I started questioning our leadership more. It wasn't long before I was no longer conservative. Story 28. Part of the reason I support universal healthcare is that a high school classmate died while rationing his insulin. Story 29. I used to drive for Dial-A-Ride, a transportation service that all cities must provide according to the Americans with Disabilities Act. I told my supervisor that passengers were complaining about being late to their appointments and were threatening to report me to the city council. My supervisor told me not to listen to them. He said the city council did not actually care if the service fulfilled its intended function. All they cared about was meeting the legal requirement of providing the service. Story 30. When I worked for the St. Louis public school system, as well as several others in the area, I was a contractor. This included King, Vashon, Normandy High, yes, that Normandy. Also Kirkwood, the magnet schools, and one of the top private schools in the area. I was never foolish enough to think there weren't huge differences in the quality of education a child could receive depending on their school. However, I didn't understand the school-to-prison pipeline or how some schools treated their students. This was a long time ago, and I hope it has improved. It completely changed my views on the education system and the politics behind it. Story 31. Lots of facets to this question. Not exactly political views per se, but it certainly altered my political stance on some issues. Here are a few. I did some work with people who panhandle at intersections and became much more jaded about them. They are pretty much scam artists with almost no exception. I also worked with many addicts, particularly those addicted to opioids. They are not always the cream of society, but many were previously very responsible people who got hooked after legitimate injuries and fell down the rabbit hole. I stopped making assumptions and automatically casting dispersions. I learned that, by and large, police officers are not bad people. They are generally good folks who want to serve, earn their pay, and take care of their families. However, there is a small minority who seem to live up to the reputation of all cops are bastards, and taint the majority who are legitimately hardworking. I saw a lot of poor people and learned that it is very, very expensive to be poor. A Sisyphean situation. Story 32. I work with children who drop out of traditional school because they often fall on the autism spectrum, have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, or are gifted. Many of the boys could be, and often are, classified as involuntary celibates. I used to have the general dismissive and judgmental view against involuntary celibates, like most people. However, these children often mean well, struggle with social skills, and are jaded by negative experiences, feeling punished for it. The world is built for people with well-developed social skills, but like all skills, some people do not possess them. There is very little room in modern society to develop these skills later in life, especially when you are neurodivergent. Story 33. It didn't change my belief, but watching Joel Osteen refuse flood victims into his church and mansion reinforced my belief that organized religion is man's greatest con. Story 34. Trayvon Martin was shot in a neighborhood that I frequented. I ran there, walked there, and more. I was training for a marathon, and it was on the way to my long-run route. I ran through, walked through, and stumbled through early in the morning or late at night to escape the Florida heat. I was never confronted, never felt endangered, and never felt nervous. It was a totally unremarkable place. When he was killed, I was incredulous. That's a totally normal neighborhood. And I finally understood what white privilege is. Story 35. When I heard someone proclaim, "The Bible says Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve," it was so profoundly brainless that I was awakened to civil rights and non-judgment of others. Then I entered the workforce and quickly made it to the entry level of salaried employee. I saw people working hard every day, good people who did not have the good fortune to have a degree like I had. Sure, I earned my way and paid my loans back over the years, but I was no better than them. From that point, I chose the side of labor over management. Then the George W. Bush presidency came, bungled the economy, and got involved in badly managed military action. This was all happening around a small-town kid in a deeply conservative state at about the same time. I have been a solid Democratic Party voter ever since. Story 36. When I worked at a Christian organization that was really homophobic, I grew up with a strong faith base but was taught to love everybody, not just those who were straight. Then more hypocritical behavior emerged, and I saw who these people supported from a political aspect. I was done with both that company and that denomination. Story 37. 2007. It turns out there were no weapons of mass destruction all along. Also, deregulating banks is apparently a bad idea. Story 38. I experienced the reactionary machine in the United States spin up to support an illegal invasion of Iraq. Live coverage of the fighting, televised bombing runs on Baghdad, complete insanity. I saw how propaganda has power and how the right wields it to their ends. I kept notes on who came out on top. It wasn't working people. I saw people who were peacefully protesting called traitors for not wanting to murder random strangers across the planet. I learned very young that violence is a tool, and I know that many hands make light work. I don't see a difference between me, any random Iraqi, Iranian, Russian, Korean, or anyone else. If we as working people don't demand our right to life, then none will be given and all will be taken. Solidarity forever. Story 39. It did not change, just confirmed. Spent several weeks and months at our state capitol dealing with legislation that affects thousands of businesses and employees statewide. It is not red versus blue, it is the people versus the rich, including legislators. Who has more money to fight? Who funded certain private organizations? Who has more money for public relations? Nothing is about helping the people, and this applies to both sides. Legislators in the chamber do not even know the issues at hand, only what they are supposed to say and vote by their liaisons and handlers. Story 40. My father is a very bitter man who raised me to be as racist, ableist, misogynistic, xenophobic, homophobic, and generally hateful towards the world as he was. When I was 16, with barely any friends and nothing but despair for the world I inhabited, I caught an episode of Doctor Who on television and then binged the whole show. I don't know why this specific show, since kindness and open-mindedness are very common in children's television after all, but I realized that I had the option of not being hateful. From there, I started working on myself, and after years of therapy and self-reflection, I no longer share this hateful vision of the world. Don't underestimate the power of fiction, I suppose. Story 41. I used to be a conservative and a Christian. In the years following September 11th, I was disappointed in the direction of the nation with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security and the "at war with Islam" attitude. I backed away from politics in general and tried to become a better, more authentic Christian. It did not work. I ended up an atheist and a much happier person for it. In 2008, it became absolutely clear that the cause of the crisis was the very banking deregulation that was celebrated by conservatives. Being a slow learner, I was still undecided ahead of the primary elections. When Sarah Palin was introduced, I knew there was no way I could bear the spin required to believe she could be anything other than a disaster. I voted for Barack Obama both times and have striven to become a more pragmatic, reality-based person and have moved progressively leftward ever since. Story 42. Meeting enough women who had abortions for a variety of reasons and realizing from their shared experience that none are baby killers shows that abortion is a private decision between a woman and her doctor. Story 43. I was a hardcore libertarian throughout college, then saw that private sectors are just as prone to the same inefficiencies that exist in government after I started working full-time. Many of my veteran friends feel the same. Story 44. When I was old enough to start reading, books showed me that things were much different from what I saw around me. Then I started noticing things in television and movies. Story 45. I wouldn't say this exactly changed my views, but more that my views hadn't formed yet, and this just determined my view. I had a good friend in elementary school whose mother was deported when we were in 5th grade. This was needlessly cruel. She was married to a United States Navy veteran, spoke perfect English, had 3 kids in elementary school, including one who was severely autistic, and she was the model of how to be a parent to a special needs child. Why would we need to deport her? To be clear, this is not a political issue related to any specific administration. She was deported during the Bush years. My friend did not want to have a birthday party until she was able to come back, but we convinced him to have one anyway and get his mom on the phone from Mexico. This story has a happy ending because she was given a green card to return less than a year later, and she obtained United States citizenship when I was in college. However, our immigration policies were unnecessarily cruel during that time. Do we need better border security? Yes, that sounds reasonable. Sympathize with towns on the border that are overwhelmed with more immigrants than they can handle. Do we need to deport violent criminals who entered illegally? Yes, but we do not need to deport mothers who have been living here for years as model citizens. We were a worse country for not having her here. Story 46. Went to live in a developing nation. When you have true poverty rubbed into your face daily, the notion of trickle-down economics and picking yourself up by your bootstraps becomes absurd. Some people need help, but without robust social services, there is no entrepreneurship that will get them off the bottom economic rung. Their children will not have a better shot at life even if they work very hard. They will die without free medical attention. If they are not fed, some will literally starve. In the United States, we still have the luxury of turning this into a partisan talking point and not facing the tragedy it really is. For now. Story 47. The video of Omar Khadr being interrogated in Guantanamo Bay. I was a year younger than him. It made me cry. There was a big debate within America about the morality of torture, with Republicans supporting it. After that video, I could never take conservative positions again. Story 48. I was left-leaning, then right. Now I hate everything. Both sides are bad, and both sides hate you. There is whataboutism everywhere. Story 49. I used to be a far-right-wing Christian conservative. Racist, sexist, homophobic, and so on. Then I met people whom my former political party ostracized. It turns out we are all people, and God did not make white straight males better or favor them more than anyone else. I am now independently liberal. Anyone who tries to influence others toward their tribalistic groups needs to re-examine themselves and consider others' perspectives before they speak. Story 50. Prior to 2020, I described myself as apolitical. In 2020, I went back to university to study journalism. One of the first things we were taught was that about half the stories most journalists report on are related to politics, so it is best to at least understand how politics works. The more I read on the subject, the more I realized politics is actually interesting, and that there is a side in politics that aligns with my personal values. Story 51. I used to be an extreme conservative. Think Ronald Reagan, not the actions of the MAGA movement. It was not one specific instance, but I have become much more moderate, at least on the social side of things, over the years as I gained a broader perspective. Story 52. I worked as an officer in a state prison. I changed my political views from Republican to liberal after that experience. The corruption was unbelievable. Story 53. I met some of the people advocating for allowing medically assisted death. They were extremely kind individuals with terminal illnesses who were in pain every day and just wanted to be able to end their lives peacefully with their family around them. I remember one of them said that we grant dogs and cats this peace and dignity when they have reached the end, but we do not grant humans the same kindness. We leave humans to suffer until the very end and die of natural causes, often alone. I now think it is possible to discourage suicide among people whose lives can genuinely get better, while still allowing for a peaceful death for people with terminal conditions. Story 54. I was very conservative, from a small town in the United States of America. I went to a big city, got an education, and realized that a lot of the ideas I thought were true were not fully developed. For example, the idea that cities have more crime is because there are more people in cities. The belief that cutting taxes for the wealthy is good and that wealth will trickle down has been proven false over decades. Wealth inequality is now higher than it was in the Roaring '20s. All that education, usually in the form of me repeating something I was taught, followed by someone disagreeing and me trying to prove it, slowly made me realize I was wrong. Teachers did not do this. They tend to stay away from politics to avoid upsetting anyone, in my experience. This process made me more liberal, not democratic, but definitely more progressive than the typical American conservative. Story 55. Not anything personal, but I used to be more center-right. I hated talk radio of any kind and rarely watched opinion shows. I always called them by my book shows. Someone is always trying to sell a book, and that always irritated me. While I did like George Herbert Walker Bush and the old New England-style Republicans, I never liked the Jesse Helms and Strom Thurmond types. Moving to the ultra-conservative Bible Belt and the subsequent Tea Party movement, Sarah Palin, Breitbart, and others completely turned me off to the Republican Party. Story 56. I was never pro-war, but working in Vietnam, where the United States of America dropped large amounts of bombs from B-52 bombers to win the hearts and minds of the locals, emphasized how badly the United States of America can fail at foreign policy. Story 57. It is very telling how people shift to the political left after witnessing or experiencing inequality, while others move to the political right because feminists have annoyed them slightly. Story 58. I was raised by Eisenhower Republicans, so I naturally became one when I turned 18 in the late 1980s. I joined the military, saw a good portion of the world, observed what American foreign policy had devolved into, and realized the grand old party of my present day was not consistent with those values. It has only gotten worse. The grand old party changed fundamentally with Richard Nixon and is not even close to what it was in the past. The Democrats are not much better, but at least they are trying. I claim to be more of a bull moose these days, minus any ingrained racism, sexism, homophobia, or anything like that. So, basically a progressive socialist. Story 59. In 2020, when quarantine happened and I saw how people acted, I went from being a libertarian to as far left as possible. Story 60. It is interesting that most, if not all, of these people are moving to the left. It is almost as if humanity has an innate drive toward empathy, and one side of the spectrum reflects that, while the other is based on hate. Story 61. My friends coming back from the military after September 11th were affected mentally, physically, or not at all. I strongly disagree with the Republican Party, politicians, and those who promote war. Story 62. Reading a bunch of these, I know Reddit skews to the left, but it is interesting that most responses show a shift from conservative views to more liberal perspectives. It is almost like once you have real-world experience, you realize conservatism is built on pitting you against people perceived as different from you. I was an independent until very recently but have vowed never to vote Republican again. Story 63. As a teenager, I was deeply interested in liberty and drawn to objectivism and libertarianism, but seeing the struggles of poor people and reading about positive liberty made me change my mind. I still think freedom is important, but it alone is not sufficient to create a humane and prosperous society. Story 64. Let's just see. I have seen enough of this world to know that Denmark holds the answer to a perfect world and that our politics, with a few upgrades and modifications, will form a paradise on Earth. Story 65. I grew up extremely liberal, all about second chances and leniency. Now, seeing the state my city is in, I realize we need to treat crime as crime. I understand that deinstitutionalizing the mentally ill is not good for them, let alone the general public. I recognize that many drugs are illegal for a good reason. Story 66. I was always indifferent about immigration to the United Kingdom until I attended a university in a rough area and noticed how much grooming was carried out by foreign nationals. Now, I am not particularly fond of the current immigration rules, to say the least. Story 67. I lived in New Zealand and gradually realized that the United States was inferior in comparison, and that we could and should fight for our tax dollars to benefit the average citizens much more than they do. Before moving there, I would not describe myself as conservative but rather neoliberal. I was definitely influenced by a youth spent being told the United States was the greatest country ever and everything was fine. I had hopes for a while that things would change. Even though most people would not be privileged like I was to see it in person, I believed that with the internet allowing easier connections, Americans could become aware of life in other Western countries and demand better for themselves. I was naive not to realize how effectively wealthy people would use it against us to make things worse. Story 68. When the people I advocated for all my life turned on me without hesitation, it happened so fast it was hard to process. I still consider myself politically left in general, but I do not associate with the broader movement anymore, and I am very cautious about which causes I support. Over the past few years, the political left has engendered such deep hostility towards Jewish people that it could take a generation to disentangle. Story 69. A few instances. 1. I was unfairly treated for a job I applied for because of an inclusion initiative in my company. I worked hard for 6 years outside of work, totaling 12 years at the company, to make myself the best candidate. Ultimately, they did not even interview me, they just set up a discussion where they said they were heading in a different direction. They hired a minority candidate who did not have the education I acquired after working long hours at the same company and did not have the experience I gained both in that business and outside of work. I helped them as best I could and was unhappy about the hostility they received for simply applying. My takeaway is you cannot legislate or force inclusion. Judge people on their body of work and the content of their character, not the color of their skin. I know many people have been affected by this and vote solely on this issue, which I understand. I did not vote for Donald Trump because I do not like racism of any kind, but in normal circumstances, race would have been a significant factor for me. 2. I was harassed a lot as a teenager. The police treated me and my friends unfairly for being young. As I reached my 20s, the harassment stopped. My takeaway is I grew older, but some people cannot shed the stereotypes they are profiled under. Police officers should be monitored, and there should be full transparency of their actions. In many cases, bullies are drawn to the job, so when they act unprofessionally, there should be a zero-tolerance policy that disqualifies them from ever being police officers again. 3. I am a Christian and will be the first to tell you that many in the faith are hypocritical and judgmental. I believe you should only measure yourself and your actions against the teachings of Jesus, not others. Unfortunately, that does not happen, and people are easily pushed into political views that they see in a very superficial way as the righteous party, ignoring all other unrighteous acts. My takeaway is I believe in the separation of church and state, and I will not vote for a candidate who constantly blurs those lines or uses religion as a political tool, no matter how much they say they align with my views. The trust is broken. 4. I studied abroad, traveled the world, and experienced other cultures. My main purpose was to study other political systems. My takeaway is that a two-party system only hurts the middle and lower classes. We harm ourselves by believing we are throwing away our vote by voting for a third party. Was in Scotland when the Scottish National Party was growing. I thought they would gain momentum, but Scots initially rejected the idea. The party shifted focus to a broader platform and shortly after became dominant. I live in the United States, and we need one or several parties to do the same. 5. Donald Trump's presidency made me feel that presidents have been expanding their power, and the trend was alarming. The balance of power and our political system are now at risk. It is also incredible how many Republicans fell in line with his actions. Likewise, it was equally disturbing how many Democrats supported a barely cognizant Joe Biden for re-election. All this has led me to align most closely with libertarianism. I do not like big government or when government policies interfere in my daily life. States should rule themselves unless something is unconstitutional. I look for third-party candidates to support in hopes that my fellow citizens will also abandon these two parties. In presidential elections, I look for candidates willing to decrease their own power, which is hard to find. I do not always avoid dominant parties, but it is rare to find one who is not part of the political machine. I do not like racism and understand it exists. I just do not think government initiatives help combat it. If anything, they add fuel to hatred when someone is wronged. I was fortunate to have perspective when it happened to me, but others do not have that. I do not care what someone identifies as, who they marry, or what they want to do in their leisure time, as long as it does not infringe on someone else's rights. I will strongly defend a person's right to live in a way drastically different from my own. Story 70. I have been seeing many Jewish friends who had previously been very progressive and liberal do a complete turnaround once they saw their allies turn against them. Story 71. In college, I had a friend in the Reserve Officers Training Corps come out to me as gay and expressed that they found me attractive. They mentioned that they understood I wasn't interested but wanted me to know because they did not want anything they said or did to be misinterpreted, and they trusted me. This was a decade before the end of the don't ask, don't tell policy. When I was taken aback, they made a comment. This is heavily paraphrased more than 20 years later, asking how it is different from if a woman I found utterly unattractive expressed interest in me. Would I be unable to reciprocate and still treat them with respect as a person, or would I view them as less? That struck a chord with me, reaching the core of my beliefs. I credit them with opening my worldview. While it was not immediate, I definitely became a lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and plus community ally in the long run. This process helped cement my humanistic outlook. Story 72. I grew up in a fairly conservative area and attended parochial school for 8 years, so my beliefs early on aligned with my parents. I don't think there was one big event that changed my mind, rather a series of experiences. I was bullied horribly at the parochial school, much more than when I attended public school for high school. Meeting people in high school who were part of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and others community influenced me. I also found out that one of the pastors from my church sexually assaulted my best friend from grade school when he was supposed to be providing her grief counseling after her mother passed away. Moving to a bigger, more diverse area for college further shaped my views. I have never understood people telling me I would become more conservative as I got older. I am 39 now, and if anything, my beliefs have moved further to the left. Story 73. Working in retail, you truly encounter people from all walks of life. I wanted them to be as happy as I am. Story 74. I participated in, then ran a charity for my county that collected and distributed toys to children for Christmas morning. About 95% of the parents who showed up were hustlers. Many repeat participants arrived in late model cars, some with luxury brands. Others claimed to have 3 or more children than the year before. Some argued with the staff to get better toys, not junk. Others had scams planned where they would sell the toys online to secondhand stores or try to return them for credit or cash at stores that sold the items. The year we started sharing lists of people with other charities, we found that about 60% of our participants were receiving identical resources from several groups. A very small percentage of people were actually experiencing hardship, and at first that made it worth the effort. But after a while, dealing with entitlement, scams, and hustlers became exhausting. This experience greatly affected my outlook on charitable giving as well as welfare systems that were established as safety nets but became long-term entitlements for many. Story 75. Got a job in the government and saw how inefficient the entire system was. There was rampant nepotism, protecting individuals from any accountability. It usually took a significant event for someone to be fired, often something so bad it made the news. I also dealt with many people in poverty who took pride in exploiting the system, treating it like an actual life plan to keep having children for more benefits. Story 76. I remember walking into work on Wednesday morning and seeing on television that Donald Trump won back in 2016. It did not result in a change in politics, but it made me realize I had no idea what was going on in the United States. It sent me on a journey to understand what happened, and now my political views have shifted significantly. Story 77. My gradual shift from left of center to right of center began in college, as I observed student activists staging increasingly trivial protests over insignificant issues. For context, this was the late 1990s. What solidified this shift was working in the defense industry for an extended period. I am not a Republican, nor am I inherently opposed to government solutions of any kind, but there is nothing like interacting with government acquisition personnel to convince one that government solutions are rarely efficient and should be used only as a last resort, especially when addressing problems that the private sector handles more effectively. Now, I know what you are thinking, defense contractors, right? I understand. I used to think that too, and many of them are problematic. I know because I work for one. What people often do not realize is that defense contractors behave as they do because the government has shaped and molded them through the way it writes contracts and manages programs. The hardest part of my job is that the better I perform, the less money my company makes, and the more likely we are to lose the next contract. Navigating that mix of incentives every day is challenging. Story 78. I watched my politicians and judges call the original sentence of life without parole too cruel for the murderer of my family member. Then I watched compassionate parole board members take pity on the murderer of my family member. Story 79. I was pro-universal healthcare and dismissed concerns over death panels. Then the British government murdered Alta Fixler. Story 80. No one specific incident, but when a couple of my friends had children who identified as the opposite gender, I was good friends with them and asked questions. They had many of the same questions I had. They were just trying to help their children with whatever they wanted to do, whatever made the children feel better about themselves. I opened my eyes to the situation, seeing all the hate toward that group of people who are statistically more likely to die by suicide is really disgusting. Story 81. I was raised in a conservative, die-hard Republican household, mainly influenced by my dad. My Japanese mom was indifferent to U.S. politics and thought American politics was borderline insane. I went to college and actually talked with people far outside my bubble of influence. Also, reading a lot of history and seeing how many times the United States has wronged others made me realize that I am liberal. To be honest, I truly see the hypocrisy and shame from both sides of the political spectrum. Every election, big or small, always feels like choosing the lesser of two evils. Nowadays, it basically comes down to which side is ultra-hypocritical and which side is completely insane. Story 82. Seeing my black father get repeatedly stopped and pulled over, no matter what car he was driving, became very tiring. Story 83. Not myself, but my Make America Great Again conservative parents got involved in an incident that led to them being stalked and harassed by police detectives for years. This included illegal investigations and cover-ups. Anytime someone starts praising police officers as American heroes, they have expressed strong disagreement. They fully support the phrase "all cops are bastards" and consider police officers to be state-sanctioned criminals. Story 84. My dad was a right-wing bigot. I have always felt that there are two things you can do with that kind of example from a parent. You either adopt it or learn from it and go the opposite way. I do not remember a particular event, but it was something that happened during my difficult childhood. Story 85. I was politically clueless until I was 18 in 2014, which was not an election year. Then I started listening to a podcast. 3/4 of the hosts were more left-leaning but politically quiet, while 1/4 was vocally libertarian. I slowly began leaning libertarian to the point that I voted for Gary Johnson in 2016, mostly because he was my only source of political opinions at the time. It was an echo chamber of one. My slight right-leaning tendencies ended once Donald Trump won, and the libertarian on the podcast left. Now, I would say I am borderline socialist. Story 86. My dad called an older man holding a sign at a freeway exit a lazy freeloader who needed to get a job. He said this to me in the car, not to the man directly. The man was clearly not fully mentally healthy and had large, erratic twitches. I wasn't trying to be ableist, but I asked my dad, where is he supposed to work and doing what? He didn't have a specific answer. It was like, if he can stand there, he can work, and if he can't, he should just die. My dad was a loud, arrogant, selfish man who identified as a libertarian. I think I was a Democrat-leaning moderate at the time. Whatever I was, he pushed me much further left. Story 87. Joining the Marines and being stationed in Okinawa presented three very important experiences that have shaped my political ideology over the last 15 years. First, during a leave to Seoul, I had to visit the emergency room on the guidance of my future wife. I was very worried about the price since I did not have travel insurance. They did x-rays and 4-drip blood tests and more. The service was fast and professional. I paid about 250,000 Korean won, approximately $225 for everything, including medication. This experience changed my views on healthcare for life. Second, walking around the shadiest alleys in Japan and Korea made me realize that the discomfort I felt came from living 2 decades in the United States without knowing if people were armed. My thoughts on weapon ownership and its costs and benefits to society drastically changed. Third, I married a foreigner. I went through the process usually believed to be the easy route for visa sponsorship and eventual citizenship. There is nothing easy, simple, or cheap about it. The U.S. immigration system is a mess, and those who complain the loudest about it often do not want to fix it because they benefit politically by generating fears about caravans and replacement theories. The Marines introduced me to more walks of life in 8 years than many people experience in a lifetime. Because of that exposure, I shifted from conservative viewpoints to strong liberal beliefs. Story 88. I didn't get into politics until after I saw how despicable the Republican Party acted after Barack Obama won the election. I grew up in central Illinois, so I was pretty blind to how bad the racism was in our country. That put it on full display with them literally making up lies about where he was born in an effort to undermine him. Republican members of Congress fully stopped being even partially bipartisan and openly stated they would vote no on everything, even if it would help the country, just to spite Obama. My opinion of them can't ever change after that, especially since so many Americans won't even admit any of that happened. After that, it was just constant hypocrisy. Obama was seen as bad, but he handed Donald Trump the very same booming economy that Trump falsely claimed credit for. This was proven when, by the end of year 2, the economy was already doing horribly. Trump had to waste money bailing out farmers after the crisis he created with China. His followers claim mentioning race is racist. Yet killing people specifically for being black by law enforcement officers is not seen as racist. They called out Obama for circumventing Congress, even though he only did it because Republicans had gone 100% partisan. Then they turned around and excused Donald Trump for his actions, most of which were illegal and unconstitutional, violating American rights. Then you have the attacks on the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender community over entirely made-up issues. Book banning, banning transgender surgeries, banning abortions, all while claiming to be for small government. Hypocrisy. Then you get to January 6th, the most heinous domestic terrorist attack our country has seen since the Civil War. If it had been any other president, they would be facing a firing squad for that. If Bill Clinton had done it, Republicans would all be demanding it right along with Democrats. But Donald Trump gets a pass despite video evidence he caused. The entire event. Multiple witnesses said they saw him smile while watching the footage. He was even heard chanting, "Hang him," when the rioters were chanting about hanging Mike Pence. Mitch McConnell went on live television saying that Donald Trump was 100% responsible for January 6th, yet he still voted no on impeachment. Entirely ridiculous. You also have the Supreme Court justice situation. Barack Obama was not allowed to appoint a justice with the given reason that it was January in an election year. Then they immediately allowed Donald Trump to appoint one literally a week before the election. Congress needs to make laws that punish actions like that with jail time because that is unacceptable. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.